Welcome to the Harvard Business School video series. In this program, Professor Michael Porter of the Harvard Business School introduces industry analysis and discusses how to position a company within its industry and how to create an effective strategic planning process. A leading authority on strategy, Porter is the author of Competitive Strategy, Competitive Advantage, and Competition in Global Industries. For suggestions on how best to use this video cassette and accompanying material, please refer to the viewer's guide and the user's manual in your video package.
I'm Michael Porter, and this is my Harvard Business School classroom where I teach about competitive strategy. Some of you may be very familiar with my ideas on strategy, and others of you may be just learning about the subject. It's a complicated subject. Here at Harvard, I spend about 50 sessions covering strategy with my MBA students. And clearly we're not going to be able in a short program like this to cover everything in this subject. But we've got on our side a very powerful tool, and that's the power of the video medium. Through this medium, I hope I'm going to be able to give you some of the essential concepts of developing strategy, but more importantly, to take you behind the scenes in a series of industries and important American companies to bring the concepts of strategy to life. And in the course of talking to the executives involved and seeing strategy in action, we can learn some lessons about strategy that are hard to learn any other way. What is competitive strategy? Competitive strategy is the positioning of a company in its competitive environment. Now, positioning means more than just product positioning or the marketing concept. It's the total positioning of the company involving all the functions: production, distribution, logistics, service. The total picture of the enterprise is placing to the competitive environment. Now, how do we go about developing a strategy? Well, in developing a strategy, there are two fundamental questions that we've got to address. The first is the structure or attractiveness of the industry or industries in which we're competing. Some industries are a lot more profitable than others, year in and year out. And we simply must understand why. Because one of the essential parts of developing a strategy is to know how good the game is in which you're trying to compete. The second essential question in strategy is a company's position within its industry. Again, if we look at many industries, we see that no matter whether the industry profits are high or low, companies in the same business have widely different levels of profitability. Some, year in and year out, make a lot more money than others. And any strategist must understand what it takes to be a superior performer in the industry and not be one of the ones that's below average. Both of these questions are vital in developing strategy. Now let's turn to the first question, industry analysis. In any industry, no matter what it produces, whether it's a product or service or of any type, there are 5 basic forces of competition at work that are illustrated on this chart. The force in the middle is the one we most commonly think about, the rivalry among the existing competitors, the jockeying for position, price cuts, new product introductions, new capacity, that sort of thing. In some industries, rivalry is very gentlemanly and genteel. In other industries, rivalry is cutthroat. Somebody's always attacking the other guy. And as we'll see later, this is not an accident. Now, this diagram, however, suggests that industry competition is broader than just the rivalry among the existing competitors. There's the threat of new entry, the threat that new competitors can come into the game. And they bring in new capacity, and if entry is easy, if it's easy for new players to come into the industry, that's going to erode the fundamental attractiveness of the industry. So one crucial dimension of industry structure is the barriers to entry. Industries also compete with substitute products or services. These are other products or services that can do the same thing as the industry's product. So for example, if you're selling steel, you're worried about plastics and other materials because they're substitutes for what your industry produces. If an industry faces close substitutes, this places a cap or a constraint on prices in the industry. You can only raise your prices so much or you'll start to erode the volume as the buyer deserts you to the substitute. You're always buying from suppliers in any industry. You're buying inputs like labor, materials, and machinery. To the extent that suppliers have bargaining power, they can constrain the profitability of an industry because they can, by bidding up their own prices, force the industry to absorb costs that it can't pass on in turn to its own buyers. They can strip the profitability out of an industry. And finally, of course, every industry sells to buyers. And those buyers may or may not have bargaining power. If they have bargaining power and if they're price sensitive, they may bargain away the profitability of the industry by demanding lower prices, by expecting more service that they don't pay for, and so on. So what we see is that in any business, the fundamental long-term profit potential is a function of the strength of these 5 competitive forces. The mix of forces will depend on the industry. Every industry is unique. But the overall strength of the 5 forces is going to determine whether an industry is a profitable one in the long term or one that's mediocre. Now, what determines the strength of each of the competitive forces, whether it be rivalry or buyer power or supplier power or whatever? Each of the competitive forces is shaped by a number of underlying structural determinants. In the case of rivalry, it's things like how fast the industry is growing, how high are the fixed costs, how much can you differentiate yourself from your rivals. These underlying determinants of each force are described in detail in your user's guide. They represent the raw material that you use to conduct industry analysis. To bring these ideas to life, let's take a look at a number of specific industries and see if we can't use this framework to assess their fundamental potential and how it might be changing. The pharmaceutical industry is an $80 billion industry worldwide, and it's one of the most profitable industries of any industry in the economy of any country. The average after-tax return on equity in the pharmaceutical industry has been around 20% for as long as anybody can remember, and very few companies ever have a bad year. Now, why is the pharmaceutical industry such a profitable business? Why is this such a terrific game to be in? Well, to answer that question, let's go back to our 5 competitive forces. Let's start with a buyer. There are 3 different buyers of drugs, but neither the doctor who chooses the drug, the patient who wants to feel better, or the insurance plan that pays most of the cost are price sensitive. Now let's turn from the buyer to the barriers to entry into the industry. How hard is it to get into the pharmaceutical industry? Well, the answer is it's darn hard, for 2 important reasons. The first is that in order to get your drug accepted by the doctor, you've got to have thousands of salespeople. They're called detail men in this industry. And they call on the doctor and tell that doctor about new drugs and try to persuade the doctor to try the drug out on his or her patients. And it's very, very expensive to set up one of these organizations, and the doctor is very busy. In addition to a sales force, you need to actually come up with a new drug. You need something innovative to sell to that doctor. And the average cost of developing a new drug today is about $100 million. $100 million just to get into the game. And about $60 million of that is the cost of testing the drug to get it approved by the government. And that takes years. In fact, there's not been a significant new entrant into the pharmaceutical industry since the 1950s, when Syntex entered on the back of their breakthrough in contraceptive pills. Suppliers have little power in this industry. The cost of purchasing ingredients used in making a drug is a small percentage of total cost. Most ingredients are commodities where suppliers have little room to raise prices. There are also few substitutes. Once an effective drug is on the market, it takes years for another therapy to make headway against it. Now, how about the process of competitive rivalry in the drug industry? Well, the process is pretty gentlemanly in this industry. Drug companies don't compete on price. They don't compete on price because they don't have to. The buyer isn't price sensitive. They are able to hold up the prices and compete instead on things like their brand reputation, the quality of their sales force, things that don't erode the profitability of the industry. So the pharmaceutical industry is what you might call a 5-star industry. Every one of the 5 competitive forces is favorable. Let's turn to another industry, the airline industry, with a very different level of performance. For much of the post-World War II period, the airline industry has been regulated, both in the United States and in many foreign countries. And this industry illustrates very well how government can fundamentally affect the structure of an industry. Now, how do we think about the role of government in industry competition? It's tempting to view government as the sixth force, to add to the other five. But from our experience, that's not the best way to look at it. The best way to look at it is to see how government is affecting the other five. And by affecting each of the other five forces, government can either be a positive or a negative for industry competition. Now let's look at airlines. Under regulation, government suspended the structure of the airline industry. Prices were fixed, offsetting any power of the customer. Airlines were not allowed to enter new routes, nullifying rivalry. And new airlines were not really allowed into the industry, in effect, making the barriers to entry unbelievably high. Under regulation, the airline industry's profitability was reasonably good. But deregulation unleashed the fundamental structure of the airline industry and has set in motion a set of forces that have led to very mediocre returns since deregulation took place. Now, barriers to entry are very low. All you need is a few planes and you can enter 2 or 3 cities and you've got yourself an airline. And in fact, dozens of airlines have entered the industry as soon as it was allowed by government. The buyer is pretty price sensitive and is not very loyal. How long will you wait for the airline of choice? 15 minutes, 20 minutes? Customers are willing to switch from one airline to another based on who's convenient, who has the best price. Rivalry is intense. You have lots and lots of competitors with different cost structures, with very high fixed cost. Once you've got an airline fueled and you're going to make the trip anyway, you will cut price to get those incremental passengers. And suppliers to the airline industry have some clout too in aircraft and some other key inputs to the industry. So once government gets out of the airline industry structure, the underlying structure goes to work, and that structure is not very favorable, and the profits reflect that. Now, we've seen how to analyze an industry by looking at the 5 forces. And we've seen how some industries are fundamentally more attractive than others, and profitability reflects that. But industries are not static. Industry structure can change. It can change either for better or for worse, for 2 basic reasons. First, environmental forces, like new technology, can shift the structure of the industry. And companies, through their own strategies, also have the power to shape industry structure. How do we analyze industry structural change? Well, once again, we use the 5 forces. An industry trend or a competitor development is significant for future industry structure if it affects one or more of the 5 forces. Now, to understand how this works, let's go back to the pharmaceutical industry, that gold mine I talked about earlier. In the pharmaceutical industry, there are 3 important changes that threaten to undermine that tremendous profitability of the industry. The first has to do with the buyer. Remember that buyer who didn't care about price? Well, that's starting to change. There's increasing pressure on cost control. It's coming from the government. It's coming from the insurance companies. It's coming because the cost of drugs has increased twice as fast as the consumer price index in the 1980s. Now, this increasing pressure for cost control is leading to the second important change in the industry, and that's the emergence of so-called generic drugs. One of these babies. A generic drug doesn't have the brand name of the manufacturer, but has the identical chemical composition. It's therapeutically equivalent.